one of the incredible things to me is that it still supports the original APIs and instruction set architecture from 1965. You can run your original IBM 360 programs on the latest generation.
Welcome to Day 2 DevOps, where the DevOps is in the details. I'm Ned Bellavance, and with me is my irascible co-host, Kyler Middleton. Hey, Kyler.
Hey, Ned. I love that descriptor of me. Today, we talked to Armon Dadgar, co-founder and CTO of HashiCorp, on the future of Hashi with IBM. This is fascinating as a conversation, so no further prelude. Let's get right to it.
It is wild how I will just be talking to my partner about something, and 5 minutes later, I'll be scrolling through something on Amazon, and it'll suggest a product that has something to do with the conversation I just had. And I'm like, it could just be coincidence, but I feel like probably not.
Well, I went down this insane rabbit hole and I could never figure it out because every time I land in a city, I get a push notification from Lyft that's like, welcome to Denver or whatever. Like, take a Lyft where you want. And I, for the life of me, can't figure out how this is getting to me because I'm like, I've turned off location when I'm not in the app. I've turned off background activity. I've tried everything in terms of like, I'm like, how is this app even opening or knowing what city I'm in? I don't know because I've disabled all of its ability to run. And I even reached the point where I'm turning off location and then I'm still getting notifications that I've landed in a random city. I'm like, how does it know this? I don't understand.
Oh, that's so weird. And you're on an iOS device, and they tend to be pretty locked down in terms of data sharing.
That's what I mean. And I'm like, so if this app with everything turned off seemingly knows within seconds of me landing in a new city where I am, then I'm like, privacy is just a lie.
Indeed. We could probably talk about privacy for the next 45 minutes, but I think we're actually here to talk about something else. So, Armand, welcome to Day 2 DevOps. We're very excited to have you on the show. For anyone who doesn't relentlessly follow the tech news, they might not have known that IBM's acquisition of HashiCorp finally closed in February, end of February. How are you feeling about that?
It's funny to your point because I think most people they're like, didn't that happen last year sometime? It's like unless you're following the news because it's like, yeah, we announced it last April, and then basically we were just put through regulatory fun times for about a year. So personally, I'm very excited that I don't spend half my week talking to lawyers anymore.
Yeah, and you're kind of in a holding pattern in terms of what you can even talk about. So I'm sure like people were constantly asking you questions and you're like, I can't answer that.
Well, I think worse is I think there was a lot of like the moment we announced that there was things where people were like, oh great, we want these like Terraform Ansible integrations, or we want like all these things. So there's things that people wanted from us right away, but part of that like regulatory process, you kind of have like a firewall between you and the acquiring company. So it's like you can do integration planning, but you're not allowed legally to do any execution on any of that stuff. So that was also a bizarre thing where you're kind of in this holding pattern of like, okay, we kind of know what we want to do, but we can't legally work on any of this stuff. And a lot of customers aren't close to that like regulatory stuff. So they're kind of just like, hey, why haven't you guys done anything for like a year?
Right. So I guess one feeling you must have is just like being released, like just relief that you're able to really dig your claws in and get stuff done again.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, okay, lawyers are out of the way. Now we can actually have like direct conversations with the Red Hat and IBM counterparts on what do we actually want to build, and then we can actually go build it and then go talk about it to the market. Because before you couldn't even really talk to customers about what you wanted to do because of some of the legal firewalls. So it's exactly that. It's a sense of release, and now like, okay, now let's go get things done.
Awesome. When I think of IBM, and IBM, please forgive me for this, but I tend to think old technology. I mean, because they've been around for 100 years almost now under various names. I think it was Herman Hollerith was the original, one of the original progenitors of it before it turned into what it is today. And they're known for the mainframes, the 360, and all that jazz up to the present day. Like when I think of HashiCorp, I think of brand new, cloud native.
Mhm.
How did the two mesh together?
Right. No, and I don't think you're wrong. I think this is a perception issue that IBM has. And frankly, even it extends to our perception. I think when IBM first reached out to us to have this conversation, my reaction was exactly yours. I'm like, what do they care about cloud? I mean, like, you know, what relevance do they even have in a cloud world? So I don't think that's just a you thing. I think that's a broader industry thing. And, to me, I think there's a very interesting, I think Satya Nadella did a bunch of good interviews when he took over about his role in really rethinking how do we think about relevance versus just thinking about revenue.
Hmm.
And I think he had this great quote, which was revenue ultimately follows relevance. And I thought that's such an interesting way of sort of capturing why is it important that you're sort of relevant to the today's conversation? Because especially in the layer we operate in infrastructure, it's like this stuff tends to be generational. Like once you adopt a generation of it, that generation then exists for the next 20, 30 years. So the reason IBM has revenue today is that they were the most relevant company in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even early 90s, because guess what? Every bank, airline, insurance, whatever still runs on mainframe, still runs on the Java middleware that they built, still runs on all that kind of stuff.
Still today, right? Like it still exists. It's just continuing to run.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I think they talk about, if you measure the world's transactional volume, like 80% of it still runs on IBM systems.
Wow.
Like think about a transaction with your credit card or airline or, whatever. That's why the revenue's there. But I think what they lost for the last, frankly, 20 years was the relevance. And I think they were the first ones to admit that, which is, hey, we up on cloud. It was too little, too late, right? Like, IBM Cloud, it exists. And then I think there was this pivot that needed to take place into saying, okay, actually, we're not going to be a, hyperscaler and a hardware provider. Instead, we need to be a software provider in a hybrid cloud world. And I think by the time they really acknowledged that was, 2019. And I think Red Hat acquisition was the first part of that. So when you think about kind of the cloud generation, they kind of missed 2 decades worth, right? And now they're playing catch up, right? Which is to say, okay, we bought our way in with Red Hat. They're buying their way into like the FinOps portfolio with Cloudability and Turbo and Apptio and those pieces. And now HashiCorp is sort of the next piece of that. So we talked about this a little bit at their Think conference this year, which is sort of this re-articulation of the strategy to say, yeah, let's acknowledge we missed. We
Right.
weren't relevant, and how do we sort of fix that and kind of get back into it? So I think you're right, which is if you said IBM of old, where would we have fit into their portfolio 5, 6 years ago? Nope, it wouldn't have made any sense. You'd be like, well, you have this odd duck that doesn't make any sense. But now I think if you think about it in that context, if we say, hey, we're re-articulating the strategy around we want to be the hybrid cloud enabler, and it's within this broader context of, hey, we're going to do FinOps across hybrid cloud, we're going to have Red Hat to do RHEL and Ansible and OpenShift and all that, and we have Hashi, all of a sudden it's a very different conversation around hybrid cloud automation, where now we don't seem like we're this strange thing that doesn't fit into the portfolio. But again, I think there's a perception issue and a brand issue that is something we have to work on over the next few years, which is like you kind of have to reintroduce IBM software as a different brand than people maybe mentally perceive.
Yeah, wow. You made so many points there that really resonated with me, especially in terms of the hybrid cloud and the fact that old technology hasn't gone anywhere. I think we had this perception that everybody was going to migrate to the cloud and everything was going to be cloudified and it'd all be like happy. But like you said, a lot of the world still runs on mainframes. A lot of the world still runs on on-prem gear. That has not gone anywhere. And I think it's, if you were too late to the cloud party, it's too late to build another cloud. Like you need billions and billions and billions of capital, but it's not too late to build on top of that cloud. I like that.
Absolutely. And I think that's the opportunity for IBM because I think if you look at the landscape and say, hey, set aside the hyperscalers, they're obviously hyper biased to their own ecosystem. Who are the big technology vendors that, can give you that cloud neutrality? You would have said it's IBM, it's Red Hat, it's VMware. Well, VMware set aside because of Broadcom. I think more people are running away from them than running to them. And Red Hat and IBM are the same company now. So does that leave you?
I'm glad you brought up VMware because I think when Broadcom announced that they were going to take over VMware, that a lot of people got scared, a lot of trepidation there amongst technologists. And I got echoes of that when the acquisition of HashiCorp was announced. Like, what is IBM going to do to them? Like, is this the end of HashiCorp? I'm curious, like, from the inside, what is your perception of how they're working with you and integrating you versus how Broadcom is treating VMware?
I mean, I think they're two such different beasts, right? And in some sense, it's like you can take them at face value. Like Hawk Tan never lied. He's a wolf in wolf's clothes, and he was like, "My plan is to eat the sheep."
That's true, yeah.
If you look at the investor deck he put out, it's like game plan is easy. The top 1,000 customers, we're going to screw them. It's like so it was like, it was not a subtle or hidden agenda or playbook. It was very front and center. And it's been the Broadcom model. They did the same thing with Symantec. They did the same thing with CA. They've done the same thing with every acquisition. Like that's the playbook that they run. So, on one hand, it's kind of like, well, they said what they were going to do and then they did what they said. So, no surprises there. I think on the IBM side, very much a different message, right? I think their message is, hey, in the same way we bought Red Hat, invested in them, and grew that business to more than double what it was. our plan is to do the same thing with HashiCorp. And I think so that was very much their message. And I think if you look at what they did with Red Hat, that was, very much what they did. They didn't go in and say, hey, we're going to go, just change pricing on and extort everybody. They very much invested in the growth of OpenShift and Ansible and really scaled those businesses from where they were. And I think with us, they're doing through the same motion. It's like we're not changing our pricing, we're not changing our licensing. What we are doing is doubling down on R&D, growing the team to be a lot bigger, locking into the much bigger IBM sales force and partner channel, and really bringing a global scale to what we're doing. But it's really an organic investment. Like, how do we take what was a $700 million business with HashiCorp and grow it to being a $2-3 billion business with IBM?
I think what I at least got out of that acquisition was that now these tools, IBM has this, reputation for like the hardware and the mainframes, but they also have this reputation of stability. And like these technologies will be around 20 or 30 or 40 years from now. And I know the IAC world, the Ansible world, there's a lot of tools that have come about that are powerful and good. And maybe it's dog eat dog for a while. But this acquisition, at least to me, says that like this Terraform tool, these Vault tools, these Hashi cool tools, they're going to exist. They're going to be 10 and 20 years from now. So enterprises can invest, people can invest their time learning them. For me, it gives me warm fuzzies, that I can implement them and they'll be relevant.
So it's so funny you say this because this is the exact sentiment some of our biggest customers had, which is, imagine you're a Hashi customer, you're spending a few $1,000,000 with us. Their fear was, hey, what happens if Broadcom buys HashiCorp?
Right.
Like, how do we want to invest? And so, for a while there was some rumors swirling that we'd be acquired, and a bunch of the customers were nervous that we'd end up at a Broadcom or worse. And so there was a huge sigh of relief, I think, when it was IBM, because exactly what you said is they're seen as this trusted partner. They know the technology will be here long after we're all dead. And so I think there was this comfort of saying, okay, we actually now feel comfortable doubling down on this investment because A, we know it's not going anywhere, and B, we know IBM's a good steward of it. And so I think exactly what you said is kind of the reaction we've seen among our bigger customers is there's a certain comfort of knowing, yeah, 100 years from now, you can still run Vault.
You say 100 years, but when we think about like the support contracts for mainframes, well, we're talking 20, 25, 30 years because they have like government contracts where that system just has to operate for the next 30 years and replacement parts and upgrades need to keep happening.
Well, what's shocking, I've learned more about IBM Z than I ever imagined over the last 6 months. One of the incredible things to me is that it still supports the original APIs and instruction set architecture from 1965. You can run your original IBM 360 programs on the latest generation.
That is wild. That's such a different system.
Yeah, right. So the thing about in technology, where can you find an API compatibility promise that lasts for 65, 70 years?
I think of Microsoft as the kings of backwards compatibility. Like they refused to deprecate things for many, many years, but IBM's got them beat. That's the winner right there.
Yeah, it's kind of nuts. So you're like, it speaks to the stewardship though. It's like they know you're like, okay, you're running a bank. What are you going to redo, rerun, rewrite all these thousands of applications? Like,
Oh, yeah, no, totally. I was doing consulting work for a travel. It wasn't a travel agency. It was a company that helped travel agencies do the bookings and the calculations, and everything was based around their mainframe. And the thought of moving any of that off, they just laughed. They're like, "Pff, no, why would we ever do that?"
exactly. And now the new version of that is getting off of your VMware plant.
Now that it's all finalized and you've got this support from IBM, what are you excited about? Like, what cool new things are you able to do?
So, some of the most neat pieces to me have been, obviously part of it's just like we'll have more R&D resources, so we'll do more on our roadmap. That's great.
Hmm.
But I think some of the truly unique stuff has been like getting to access IBM research,
Ooh, okay.
where that's been cool because they have like 3,000 PhDs that sit in their research lab
Oh, wow.
just working on like thinking 5, 10 years ahead of their product groups. And so some of the stuff that's super neat is like they're probably the foremost leaders on post quantum, for example.
Hmm.
Like of the 4 new algorithms that NIST approved, 3 of them were designed by IBM. So like they have a deep commitment into a bunch of like, okay, what does post quantum cryptography look like? How do you think about digital signatures and encryption and symmetric and asymmetric in a post quantum world? And they're the ones actually inventing that stuff. So what's neat is now we're working with that team to actually say, how do we take that and bring it to things like Vault and actually implement the post-quantum signing and cryptography and certificates? So like the latest version of Vault, we actually work with them on some tech transfer to bring one of the first signing keys into Vault to do post quantum signatures.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So like that's like a really cool thing where you're like, okay, on our own, were we ever gonna have like hundreds of cryptographers working on something like this? Like, no, like that would never be like a reasonable thing for us to do. And then I think on the AI side, they similarly have a huge team of people that are kind of working at that like frontier of AI model creation. And so there's a bunch of interesting stuff that we're trying to apply. So like, for example, with Ansible, they created a specialized small language model that they ended up calling Ansible Lightspeed, which is basically purpose trained, fine tuned on doing Ansible generation. But rather than need some ginormous, like 400 billion point model, it's a much smaller, I think 2 billion points. So it's like you can actually run on your laptop. So you can do like rapid local dev assisted by the model because it's small enough to be able to run on your laptop versus like some ginormous thing. So I think we want to do a similar thing with Terraform. So it's like, okay, how do you have like a local Terraform model that could be like, your IDE is like doing, code assistance powered by an LLM that actually can shrink wrap down. That kind of stuff is like, it's super neat, but it's like you need such a bench of expertise that like, unless you have a lot of like super high-end AI researchers sitting around, you're probably not going to do that.
Right. But IBM's like, hey, we have all these PhDs and they're doing cool stuff. You want in on this?
Yeah, and I think what's neat about those teams is I think there's some research teams that are very like ivory tower, right? Like we do our own thing and we don't touch R&D. And I think what's been neat with the R&D with the IBM folks is they very much have this notion of like tech transfer. It's not like we're just doing it for the purpose of publishing a paper and like we don't care about R&D. It's very much they see themselves as a pipeline and a forward development of R&D. So like they very much want to work with us to say, hey, we'll help build it, but then we want to do the transfer into R&D so that you guys can actually, get it out to customers. So that's been actually quite cool.
Yeah. So the Lightspeed thing translated into Terraform. I like that. I like the idea of running a local LLM that's trained on Terraform. Because I got to
Hmm.
say, like, Claude's pretty good, but it still makes lots of mistakes and it lies to me.
Hmm.
And you can't really run it locally, right? Like you're sort of tethered to the cloud because that thing is probably needs 1,000, H100s every time you type anything.
And it's just eating water, it's eating electricity and water, even if you're not paying for it like at your house. Someone's paying for it and you're paying them. So, like smaller models, they're more efficient. I want that.
Yeah, and when you think about it, I mean, to me, I think there's a bunch of interesting work on how do you prune these big models down to a relevant space. Because you think about it, it's like it's consumed all knowledge that humanity's ever produced and probably a billion YouTube videos and everything else. You're like, but did you need that to write some Terraform? Like, probably not.
I'm so glad that you know the collected works of Shakespeare, but I don't think that applies to spinning up an EC2 instance.
Now I kind of want to ask, can Claude write Terraform in iambic pentameter? And like, what would you get?
Oh, now I have a weekend thing.
What if your Terraform did rhyme? I don't know.
That's good. What about like integrations? Because I think Kyler, you brought this up. Like Ansible has become, I won't say the configuration manager, but it's pretty close. Whenever I hear people talk about
Hmm.
config management, I hear Puppet a little bit, I hear Salt a little bit, but VMware bought them, I think. So that kind of died on the vine. So Ansible's like the one left standing.
Hmm.
And then Terraform is the infrastructure as code. It's still the king. I know there's other alternatives out there, but at least for me, I'm a little biased. But the handoff between the two is still a little, it's not great. So is that going to get better?
Yes, definitively yes. So the way I look at it is there's at least four different problems we need to solve, right? Like the most basic is things like, okay, the Terraform provider for Ansible needs to be official, and like vice versa, the Ansible like modules for Terraform. So that's like table stakes stuff. We'll fix that. But then I really can say, okay, from a workflow perspective, there's at least three major other problems. Like piece one is a state one, state management. Like Terraform will go say, provision me 100, VMs. Ansible inventory doesn't know anything about it. Like that's a kludgy thing that I'm kind of manually keeping these two things in sync, and like every customer has their own workflow, and it's kind of so how does that become just sort of auto synchronized where you say, okay, the moment Terraform provisions something, there's a state change that should just auto generate an inventory and export it to Ansible, so that anytime you're talking about your inventory of machines, like it's the same inventory, right? Like the fact that it's represented in two places, that should be a detail. So I think that's piece one of the workflow to like not make it feel weird.
Right.
The second piece of it right now is there's different things you can do based on your entry point. Meaning, if I start with Ansible as my entry point to my workflow, there are certain points in Ansible that it can call into Terraform. But then if you start with Terraform, it has different entry points in terms of when it can call into Ansible. So what this creates is a weird situation where it's like, okay, if I'm doing provisioning followed by immediate config management, I start with Terraform. But if I've already provisioned and I need to modify a thing, then I need to actually start with Ansible. So it creates this screwiness in the customer workflow where it's like, well, what do you want to do? And then I'll tell you which tool to start with, even though you're going to end up using both. And it's like, that's just a experience. So we want to fix that and say, okay, it doesn't really matter. We don't care. Do you want to start your entry point with Ansible? Do you want to start with Terraform? You should be able to achieve the same thing either way by having the right call points back and forth between them to fix that so that we kind of don't care. Do you want your CI pipe to always call Terraform first or Ansible first? Whatever. Shouldn't matter. So that's kind of piece 2 that we want to fix. And then piece 3 is, if we're look at where Terraform grew up and what it was built for, it was always built for a highly immutable, cattle over pets type of a cloud infrastructure. Like that's where it grew up, was in cloud. And then you look at Ansible, and where it grew up was very much like configuration management of long-lived pets in a data center. And so there's just a slight mismatch of their domain models as a result, because like Terraform has no ways of saying like, run this thing on some existing state, right? Like Terraform's fundamentally tied to the CRUD of a life cycle of a resource. And so this means there's this kind of this mismatch in the domain models. So there's a bunch of work we want to do around kind of, I'll call it compromising in Terraform to say like, you know what, the world's not so pure.
Unfortunately, yeah.
How do we accept that you're going to have things that need to happen that maybe are pets, that maybe aren't immutable, that maybe will cause drift, but that's okay. Let's let Terraform sort of tolerate that and then use those as opportunities to then tightly integrate to Ansible and say, okay, great, you want to do patch management on an existing thing, but you don't want to tear it down. Okay, if Terraform's your entry point, we know how to call that into Ansible, right? If Ansible's your entry point, it knows how to tell Terraform, I've modified the state, but don't worry about the drift. So that's where we're kind of going in terms of like fixing that workflow. So you'll see some of the first of this stuff get announced at HashiConf. We have a bunch of exciting pieces there in September to really start saying, okay, let's fix the workflow issues in a bit of a deeper way.
I have a question. The answer might be, I can't talk about that yet. That'd be fine. So is this going to be plugins within the tools so that Terraform can talk to Ansible and read information? Or is this like a wrapper tool, like Terra Grunt style, that you run the Terra Ansible and it can trigger both of them and sort of coordinate them?
Got it. No. So it will be native to them. So rather than have to add yet another layer, it's like, no, let's do it properly and bring it into the core tools and abstractions.
Yeah. We don't have to learn a new language.
Yeah, it's a big evolution because we're sort of relaxing some constraints that we've had for a very long time, right? So it's like it's a big evolution, but I think it'll open up entirely new use cases, which I think will be exciting.
Yeah, I remember having conversations probably 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer, hard to say, about how awesome immutability is. How like just everything should be done immutably. Have to upgrade your database, do it immutably. Have to replace your domain controllers, spin up a new one, demote the old one. It like in theory it sounds great because you're always starting with the latest and it's a clean slate and you can always roll back to the old. But then I think about the way that Active Directory has been like my bread and butter for years, right? How does Active Directory tolerate you spinning up a new domain controller every week? It does not.
Yeah, the answer is not well.
Does not like that, yeah.
I don't know. At a certain point, I had to just accept, like you said, some things are going to be long lived and you have to update them in place. And we're just going to have to get over our like lofty ideals and deal with what the reality of mainframes and domain controllers and what actually exists.
Well, and I feel like this is the story arc of all infrastructure. You start wide-eyed and idealistic, and over time you're just ground down by reality into just a pure pragmatism. Because you're just like, yeah, are we ever going to get to immutable SAP deployments on like, your 4 terabyte of memory HANA machine? You're like, probably not. You're like, that machine takes 3 hours to reboot. You're like,
I just mentioned mainframes, and you said you now know more about the Z series than you ever wanted to. Is that because there are some interesting integrations coming with HashiCorp tools and the mainframes?
in fact, we've already announced a few of them, which has been kind of fun. Yeah, it's been an interesting deep dive to me because to me, it's like I knew mainframe as like a black box in my head. I'm like, yeah, like big server sits in a corner. You're probably writing COBOL and Fortran. Like that's my mental model of it. And I think what's been neat learning more about it is in many ways I describe it as it's a failure of marketing. Because if you look at what a modern mainframe is, it's really closer to what the rest of us have described as like hyper-converged infrastructure for like the last 15 years. Like it's really, if you said, what if I just put a whole bunch of storage, compute, network on a tightly integrated box? not that different from like what Cisco and Nutanix and others have done with hyperconverge. That's kind of what it looks like, because the modern thing is like you can run 10,000 Linux VMs on it. So how different is that? And it even has the OpenStack API. So how different is that than hyperconverged infrastructure? Like not really that different. I think there's a bunch of hardware stuff that makes it unique and interesting actually. And then there's obviously ZOS, which is sort of the classic, old school operating system going back to the 60s. So I think as we've learned more about it, you start to say, okay, well, if you think about HashiCorp's story, it was always we want to support the hybrid estate. So that's public cloud, private cloud, bare metal. So you're like, this just becomes yet another piece within that kind of hybrid cloud for us, rather than like it being its own silo. So as we've sort of double clicked, it's like what's become clear is like, well, why can't you manage it as infrastructure as code with Terraform? Like you can declare that you want VMs and what image you want to run and how you want to configure and partition the hardware, and like why not do that declaratively as code? And I think so that we've seen a lot of excitement from our existing Terraform customers who have mainframe in their state being like, that would be great because now it's not a special snowflake. It's just another Terraform module, basically, right? It's just a slightly different API, but it speaks OpenStack, so it's not that different. So I think that's been one. And then when you look at Vault, you're like, well, all the apps on it, don't they need secrets and keys and certificates and all of that? So like, turns out, yes. So we can create a Vault client as well as run the Vault server there. That's the piece where there's some cool stuff, because the hardware actually includes a secure enclave, so it's sort of a hardware key manager, if you will. So it can actually keep Vault's core encryption keys in hardware. And it's actually the only piece of hardware that's ever received the level 4 certification from the federal government. They basically have this FIPS 142 standard. The hardware enclaves are ranked level 1 through level 4 in terms of like how secure and tamper proof and whatever they are. And it's the only level 4 device you can even buy. So you can get to this crazy high level of assurance that like, yeah, your Vault data is never leaving this enclave. And then they support some pretty unique memory encryption stuff. So similar, if you ever read about like the Intel SGX or some of the Amazon Nitro enclaves or some of those things, they can kind of wrap an entire memory namespace and say like even the memory is encrypted during operation. So you can get to this kind of pretty neat place with Vault where you're like, yeah, your keys at rest are all encrypted in a hardware enclave, and everything in memory is also encrypted. And so it's like, it's the Fort Knox of running Vault, basically. So that's been neat. And then with Nomad, it's been actually kind of a cool one too. We have a bunch of customers who have they run Nomad as a mixed fleet. So they have Z plus Power and AIX systems plus x86 as part of a single Nomad farm. So that way they can just have a single orchestrator and you just submit your job and say, well, what architecture do you need? Do you want x86? Do you need Power? Do you need Z? And then Nomad can just schedule across the whole thing. And so that's been kind of a cool one. We've seen a few customers with that type of a pattern. So we brought Nomad to the mainframe as well. So it's been mostly driven by some customer use cases of folks kind of breaking our tools and using it in ways we didn't expect. And then we're like, hey, that's kind of cool. Is there a pattern here? And turns out, yeah, other mainframe customers are like, yeah, can we get that too?
I want to change gears for a little bit and ask you about what could be a sensitive subject, but I want to ask you about it anyway, because I know recently the Open Tofu project officially became a sandbox project with the CNCF. And I really want to hear your thoughts on the project as a whole and how you see it interacting with Terraform going forward.
So it's interesting. I mean, I think, obviously the fork almost a year and a half ago. It's been a while, 18 months maybe. At the time when they did it, we sort of said, hey, we wish you good luck. I think it's open source is one of those things where it's, it seems like it'll be fun and easy to run an open source community until you do it. And then you realize maybe not so much. So I think we said, hey, best of luck. It's easy to throw rocks and say, hey, you should have done this or you should have done that as the steward of the project. And I think until you actually take responsibility and you realize like, yeah, it turns out there's consequences for those things, and it's one thing to say, it's another thing to do. So our perspective has been, we're just going to continue focusing on being good stewards of Terraform and evolving it how we think we should, and basically not really care about what OpenTofu wants to do and say, God be with them. And I think from our perspective, most of the community and most of our customers have stuck the course, right? Like I think we've lost, very few people who have realistically left the community. If you look at Terraform downloads, if you look at the registry usage, if you look at kind of all of those things, every metric is up and to the right. So I think we haven't really seen any real impact to the HashiCorp community and the Terraform community. I think it was a lot of sound and fury, and I think for all of the hype that, every blog post is basically from them, as far as I can see, is like, hey, there's so much innovation, we've outpaced you guys. When really it looks like most of you guys just copied everything we did with a time lag. with the exception of one or two features that we purposely never added because they're a bad idea. And I think when you read their issues, they've now discovered why they're a bad idea.
Yeah, I haven't really kept up with it, but I know one big feature that I was never sold on was state encryption.
Hmm.
That's the bad idea one.
I was just messing around with it to see how it functions. I did a video and a blog post on it because I wanted to understand what they did and how it actually works. And the thing I came back with was, man, if you lose your keys, you are screwed.
Right. You have to ask yourself, it's like HashiCorp literally built Vault. So either we don't know what encryption is, and for some reason it never occurred to us to do state file encryption, despite having built a Vault product for a decade, or we didn't do it for a very specific reason. Which turns out that A, it doesn't really solve any actual problem because all it does is shift. You need to still decrypt it at the edge anyway, which means in practice, what happens in most of those cases is they're putting the encryption key anyway there. So it didn't really solve your problem. Or you have the problem you just outlined, which is you lose that key and you're F.
Yeah.
And so you're like, actually, the right way to solve it in our view is like, yeah, if you're pushing your state into something like Terraform Cloud, Terraform Enterprise, internally, guess what? It wraps it with a vault and it transparently encrypts and stores it at rest, but it gives you an RBAC control. We have break glass if you lose your key. If your admin quits your company, you're not, you can file a support ticket and we can get you back in. So it turns out like there's a recovery workflow around it. And it's like, yeah, we solved the problem of encrypting state at rest, but without putting a loaded gun in the user's hand. And so it's like, yeah, there was in fact a reason we did this. So one person's feature is another person's bug, I suppose.
I like the fact that there's two projects now, and people who are really hell bent on certain features have a way to pursue that and make it a reality. And then we can just see, how does that work out? Does it work out well? Okay, maybe it'll end up, being moved into Terraform at some point as re-implemented as a feature in Terraform. But if not, well, it gets to just stay in that sandbox.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, and for the folks that are, open source zealots, which I am, I love the open source stuff. I mean, I can go choose it. I can go do that. There's, Hashi says, go ahead. And for the enterprises that need the stability of now IBM, they can stick around on Terraform, which is what I have seen from every business I've worked with. I've said, like, there's this alternative, there's an open source one. And they're like, well, I kind of want the one that'll be around in 20 years. Like, I'm sure that it'll be here. So,
Right. Makes sense, And I think obviously I'm biased on this one, but it's like I genuinely do think HashiCorp's been a good steward of the open source. Like I think we have continued to push innovation on it. I think when we explained our BSL license change, there's a reason it was very narrow and didn't impact end users' ability to use it in however way they wanted. So I think throughout all this, we've been trying to be very clear, which is we're trying to balance an economic model that allows us to continue to innovate in the open and give users incredible free software, but also allow us to be, the commercial vendor of choice. And I think that's a balancing act that every open source company goes through. And I'd like to think we've done a good job of it, and certainly I think the rights of open source means like, great, if that doesn't work for you, or you want a different governance model, there's other choices.
Let's get philosophical for a moment. HashiCorp, you've always worked on solving challenges of infrastructure and ops in a very cloud agnostic kind of way. Now we're looking to the future. What do you see on the horizon? I think we touched on AI a little bit, but there's more to it than just that. So if you could put your prognosticator hat on, where do you see things going in the next 3 to 5 years?
Oh boy, 3 to 5 years is a long time.
I know, right?
I think there's a few different elements of it that feel kind of obvious to me. I think one, for better or worse, I will say, I think we're going to drive towards an agentic future.
Yeah.
And I won't get into the philosophical debates on it because I have mixed minds on it. But, I think no matter what, we're going to have to embrace that future. So I think it was last week at Build, we announced a Terraform MCP server, for example.
Mhm.
So there's an agent-based sort of mechanism to be able to write and modify and, query Terraform. So I think part of it is, okay, we have to embrace it and kind of go down that angle. And I think we're going to see an explosion in the amount of infrastructure that gets created to manage this stuff. Now, I think the flip side to this stuff is what I haven't yet seen AI get really good at is reusability, composability, modularity. You ask the AI to write you 10 basically similar functions, it will generate 10 basically similar implementations that are all distinct in a way that no human would ever write code like that. You'd be like, well, do I really want to repeat the same module 10 times in a row? Like you would modularize it at some point. AI doesn't. It likes to just spew out more and more. So I think the surface area that we're going to deal with is going to be massive. I think the challenge that it's going to create then is like you can't human maintain it either,
Hmm.
right? So in the same way you didn't human author it, you won't be able to human maintain it because the scale will be too high. So I do think that's creating a bunch of pressure in terms of, okay, great. On one side, we can use things like agents and MCP to generate a mess. But how are we going to use those same techniques to manage that mess on the other hand? Because otherwise we have a problem. So I think that's where we're spending a lot of our time thinking about what needs to be true for that, right? In terms of how do I think about state management in that world? How do I think about understanding the relationships between application services, infrastructure in a coherent enough way that I can start to manage that day too? And I think the challenge between those is, kind of like it always is. Creating a mess is always easy. It's cleaning up the mess that's always hard because the difference is one of context, right? Meaning if I'm like, hey, write me a new whatever JavaScript app that I don't know is for my fantasy football league or whatever, I don't know. It's easy to do that because there's no context. It's like you're starting from a blank slate and you're creating it. The flip side is when you're in sort of operations land, your whole life is day two maintaining an existing set of things. And it's never one app or two apps, or it's 500, 5,000. And so now the problem becomes as you're maintaining it, the context window you needed to create it was nothing. It was like blank slate, go make. The context window you need to maintain is here's 5,000 apps that now there's a JDK vulnerability. How do I deal with that? And you're like, by the way, no human knows about it because they didn't even touch the implementation. So I think that's going to be the challenge that we're looking at is like, we're rapidly approaching this issue. And so we're looking at like, okay, how do we solve some of those things? So we have a bunch of interesting work in the pipe we'll talk about more kind of later this year. We're doing a bunch of interesting stuff with IBM research on, like how do you deal with like very, very large, relational situations if you have billions and tens of billions of nodes and how you have to sort of run effective queries against that. So there's a bunch of interesting stuff, challenges there that I think will become more real world fast.
Kyler and I have had conversations about the graph of graphs. Like you build a DAG, but then that DAG explodes and you're like, well, maybe I only want to query a sub portion of the graph. How do I do that effectively? How do I do that efficiently? And that's like one of the problems that Terraform has is when the state gets too big, it gets too unwieldy. You got to break it up, but you still need that larger context across multiple graphs. How do you do that?
Well, that's exactly the problem we're looking at. It's like if you think about each Terraform state file is sort of a DAG, but then if you're a large enterprise, you have some that have hundreds of thousands of workspaces. Well, now what? Now you have hundreds of thousands of subgraphs that you have to go deal with. So I think that's exactly that problem of that sort of graph of graph problem of like, how do I index that in a way that's usable? How do I query that in a way that's usable? How do I like surface it to a user in a way that's even understandable? It's like, I can't just be like, here's a billion rows, have fun. Right. So I think that's some of where we're spending a lot of our time because we're seeing that happen in real time. Like we're seeing customers be like, hey, they auto-generated all this Terraform. God knows what it even does. And by the way, our security team found all these issues. You're like, well,
Sounds like the future is going to be messy and we're going to have to be the adults and try to clean it up.
and I think maybe for all the doomsdaying of AI, it's like at least it's like, our new job can be cleaning up after the AI. So that'll keep us employed for a while.
That's my current job. I have 3 kids. My life is cleaning up.
Mm-hmm.
Cleaning up after the humans, we can clean up after the humans using AI to make a bigger mess. So
Amazing. Well, Armin, thank you so much for being a guest on Day 2 DevOps. We had a blast having you on, and hopefully you'll come on again at some point.
it was my pleasure. Thank you both for hosting. It was great.
All right. I know you're a very busy person. Is there any last words of wisdom you want to leave the audience with?
No, I mean, I guess what I'd say is we got Hashi Days coming up. We'll have some fun announcements next week in London for that. And then we have HashiConf in September at Fort Mason. So we have a lot planned for that. So if folks are interested and want to learn more, would encourage folks to attend or register and live stream for free virtually as well.
Yeah. Hopefully I'll see some people there. All right. Well, thanks again and have a great day.
Likewise.
Thanks to Armand for appearing on Day 2 DevOps, and virtual high fives to you, dear listener, for tuning in. If you have suggestions for future shows or suggestions for future guests, we want to hear about that. Hit either of us up on LinkedIn or send some feedback via packetpushers.net/follow-up. You can find me, Ned Bellavance, at nedinthecloud.com and my amazing co-host Kyler Middleton at letsdodevops.com. And we're both entirely too active on LinkedIn. Stop by, say hi.
Are you a security person or do you play one on TV? You should check out the Packet Protector podcast, part of the Packet Pushers family of podcasts. On the show, Drew Conry Murray and JJ Manella provide practical cybersecurity information that IT and infrastructure pros, like you, can put to work today. Check it out at packetpushers.net.
Until next time, just remember that doing DevOps is awesome, and so are you.